A black doctor is fired for saving a pregnant woman's life. But soon after, the boss who ruined her career faces a shocking twist of fate. Will karma finally turn the tables in Dr. Marjorie's favor, or is an even bigger surprise waiting? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Dr. Marjorie Winston took a deep breath as she walked through the gleaming glass doors of Hamilton Private Hospital. The cool air inside was a stark contrast to the warm evening outside. She smoothed down her white coat and adjusted her stethoscope, ready for another night shift. As she made her way to the nurse's station, Marjorie couldn't help but notice the opulent surroundings. Plush carpets lined the hallways, and expensive artwork adorned the walls. It was a far cry from the community clinic where she had started her career. "Good evening, Dr. Winston," a nurse greeted her with a smile. "Hello, Mina," Marjorie replied warmly. "How are things tonight?" "Busy as always," Mina sighed. "We've got a full house in the VIP wing." Marjorie nodded, her heart sinking a little. The VIP wing was where the hospital's wealthiest patients stayed. It was also where she felt the most conflicted about her work. As she reviewed the patient charts, Marjorie's mind wandered to her last shift. She had spent extra time comforting a scared child, even though it meant running behind schedule. The memory brought a small smile to her face, but it quickly faded as she remembered the stern talking to she had received from Dr. Alexander Green, the hospital administrator. "Time is money, Dr. Winston," he had said, his voice cold and sharp. "We can't afford to coddle every patient who comes through our doors." Marjorie shook her head, trying to push the memory away. She knew Dr. Green saw her compassion as a weakness, but to her, it was the very essence of being a good doctor. Just then, as if summoned by her thoughts, Dr. Green appeared at the nurse's station. His crisp suit and perfectly styled hair seemed out of place in the medical setting. "Dr. Winston," he said, his tone clipped. "A word, please." Marjorie followed him to a quiet corner, her stomach tightening with apprehension. "I hope you've taken our last conversation to heart," Dr. Green began, fixing her with a steely gaze. "We have some very important patients tonight, and I need to know you'll follow protocol to the letter." Marjorie felt a flicker of anger, but she kept her voice calm. "Of course, Dr. Green. I always strive to provide the best care possible." "The best care, yes," he nodded, "but also the most efficient. Remember, these patients are paying top dollar. They expect quick, professional service, not hand-holding." As Dr. Green walked away, Marjorie felt torn. She knew the hospital's success depended on keeping its wealthy clients happy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with this approach to healthcare. She thought of her parents, hardworking people who had sacrificed so much to put her through medical school. They had taught her that every life was precious, regardless of the size of someone's bank account. With a heavy heart, Marjorie picked up her first patient's chart. She silently vowed to do her best to balance the hospital's expectations with her own values. It wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to find a way to be the doctor she had always dreamed of being. As Marjorie made her rounds, the sudden blare of the emergency alarm pierced the air. Her heart raced as she sprinted towards the ER, her white coat fluttering behind her. The automatic doors slid open, revealing a chaotic scene. A young woman lay on a stretcher, her face contorted in pain. Her swollen belly made it clear she was pregnant. "What do we have?" Marjorie asked, her voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. A nurse quickly filled her in. "Gladys De La Cruz, 22 years old, approximately 32 weeks pregnant. Severe abdominal pain and bleeding. BP is dropping fast." Marjorie's trained eyes scanned Gladys, taking in her pale, clammy skin and labored breathing. This was bad. Really bad. "We need to get her into surgery now," Marjorie ordered, already moving towards the operating room. "Dr. Winston," a voice called out. It was Linda from administration, clipboard in hand. "We need to verify insurance and payment before proceeding." Marjorie froze, her hand on the door. She looked back at Gladys, who was barely conscious now. Time was running out. "She's uninsured," Linda continued, her voice lowered. "From the looks of it, she can't afford our services." The words hit Marjorie like a punch to the gut. She knew the hospital's policy all too well. No payment, no treatment. But as she looked at Gladys, All she could see was a young woman and her unborn child fighting for their lives. "We can't just let her die," Marjorie whispered, more to herself than to Linda. Linda's face softened for a moment. "I know it's hard, Dr. Winston, but you know the rules. Dr. Green was very clear about this." Marjorie's mind raced. She thought of Dr. Green and his stern warnings. She thought of her own struggles to fit into this world of high-priced healthcare. But most of all, she thought of the oath she had taken when she became a doctor, to help those in need regardless of their ability to pay. In that moment, Marjorie made her decision. "Prep the OR," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We're going in." As the team rushed to action, Marjorie placed a gentle hand on Gladys's arm. "Hold on," she murmured. "We're going to take care of you and your baby." Gladys's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, filled with a mix of pain and gratitude. It was all the confirmation Marjorie needed that she had made the right choice. As they wheeled Gladys towards the operating room, Marjorie's heart pounded with a mix of determination and fear. She knew she was risking everything, her job, her reputation, maybe even her career. But as she looked at the young woman fighting for her life, she knew she couldn't have done anything else. Marjorie took a deep breath as she entered the operating room. The familiar scent of antiseptic filled her nostrils, grounding her in the moment. She looked at Gladys, pale and unconscious on the table, and felt a surge of determination. "All right, team," Marjorie said, her voice steady and clear. "Let's save 2 lives today." As Marjorie began the procedure, her hands moved with practiced precision. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the beeping of monitors and Marjorie's calm instructions. "BP's dropping," a nurse called out. Marjorie's brow furrowed. "Push more fluids," she ordered, her eyes never leaving her work. As she fought to stabilize Gladys, Marjorie could hear whispers around her. The words "policy" and "Dr. Green" floated in the air, sharp and accusing. She tried to tune them out, focusing solely on her patient. "Did you hear?" one nurse whispered to another. "She didn't even check for insurance." "Dr. Green's going to be furious," came the reply. Marjorie's hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them. She knew what she was risking, but she couldn't let that stop her now. Gladys and her baby needed her. The operation stretched on, each moment filled with tension. Marjorie worked tirelessly, her forehead beating with sweat. Finally, after what felt like hours, she heard the most beautiful sound, the cry of a newborn baby. "Baby's out and stable," the pediatric nurse announced. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Marjorie allowed herself a small smile before turning her attention back to Gladys. The young mother wasn't out of the woods yet. As Marjorie finished up the procedure, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back. She imagined Dr. Green's disapproving glare, his voice echoing in her head about profit margins and hospital policies. But when she looked at Gladys, now stable and slowly regaining color, and heard the healthy cries of the baby, Marjorie knew she had made the right choice. No matter what consequences lay ahead, she had stayed true to her oath as a doctor. As she stepped out of the OR, exhausted but relieved, Marjorie braced herself for what was to come. The whispers had grown louder, and she could feel the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. But for now, she had saved 2 lives, and that was all that mattered. As the adrenaline of the successful operation began to fade, Dr. Marjorie Winston allowed herself a moment of relief. Gladys and her baby were stable, both resting peacefully in the recovery room. The quiet hum of medical equipment and soft breathing filled the air, a stark contrast to the chaos of just hours before. But the calm was short-lived. The double doors of the ER burst open with a bang, causing Marjorie to jump. Dr. Alexander Green stormed in, his face twisted in anger, eyes blazing with fury. "Dr. Winston," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent emergency room. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Marjorie stood her ground, though her heart raced. "I was saving lives, Dr. Green. It's what we're supposed to do." Green's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Saving lives? You're endangering this entire hospital? Do you have any idea what you've done?" The staff around them froze, eyes darting between Marjorie and Green. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. "That patient had no insurance, no means to pay," Green spat out. "You've violated every policy we have in place. Do you think this hospital runs on goodwill?" Marjorie took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dr. Green, she was dying. Her baby was dying. You couldn't just follow the rules," Green interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Rules that are in place for a reason, Dr. Winston. We're not a charity." Marjorie felt her face grow hot with a mix of shame and anger. "We're doctors first," she argued. "Our job is to help people, regardless of their ability to pay." Green laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Oh, how noble of you. And who's going to pay for the equipment you used? The medication? The staff's time?" He turned to address the gathered staff, his voice rising. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Dr. Winston here thinks she can play hero with the hospital's resources. Well, let me make this clear. This kind of behavior endangers all of our jobs, our financial stability." Marjorie tried once more to defend herself. "But sir, if we had turned her away, then she would have been someone else's problem," Green shouted, cutting her off. "Not ours, not mine, and certainly not yours, Dr. Winston." The silence that followed was deafening. Marjorie could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, a mix of sympathy and fear in their gazes. She stood there feeling more alone than ever, as Dr. Green's words hung in the air. Dr. Green's face contorted with a mix of anger and triumph as he glared at Marjorie. "You leave me no choice, Dr. Winston," he said, his voice cold and cutting. "You're fired, effective immediately." The words hit Marjorie like a physical blow. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What? You can't—" "I can, and I have," Green interrupted. He turned to the stunned staff around them. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. We have protocols for a reason. Break them, and you'll face the consequences." Marjorie felt her world crumbling around her. Years of hard work, dedication, and compassion, all wiped away in an instant. She looked around at her colleagues, hoping to see a friendly face, someone who would stand up for her. But they all averted their eyes, too afraid to challenge Dr. Green. "Security!" Green barked into his phone. "I need an escort to remove Dr. Winston from the premises immediately." Tears welled up in Marjorie's eyes, but she blinked them back, determined not to let Green see her cry. She stood tall, her chin held high, even as her heart shattered into a million pieces. Within minutes, 2 burly security guards appeared. They approached Marjorie cautiously, almost apologetically. "Ma'am," one of them said softly, "we need you to come with us." Marjorie nodded silently. She took off her white coat, the symbol of her profession, and carefully folded it. With trembling hands, she placed it on a nearby counter. As the guards led her through the hospital corridors, Marjorie felt the weight of every step. This place had been her second home, a sanctuary where she could help and heal. Now, it felt cold and hostile. Nurses, orderlies, and patients watched in confusion as Marjorie was escorted out. Some whispered, others just stared. The shame and humiliation burned through Marjorie, but she kept her head high. At the hospital entrance, Marjorie paused. She turned to look back at the building that had been the center of her life for so long. How could a place dedicated to saving lives turn on her so cruelly? How could healing and compassion be punished? As she stepped out into the cool night air, Marjorie felt utterly lost. Her career, her passion, her purpose, all seemed to have been ripped away in an instant. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on her shoulders. Marjorie stood in her office, surrounded by the remnants of her career. Her hands trembled as she picked up a framed photo of her medical school graduation. She stared at her younger self, beaming with pride and hope. How far she had come and how quickly it had all fallen apart. Tears welled up in her eyes as she remembered the countless nights of studying, the grueling shifts as an intern, and the mountain of student debt she still carried. All the sacrifices she'd made, missing family gatherings, putting off starting her own family, now seemed pointless. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Sarah, a young nurse she had mentored. "Dr. Winston," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. What they did to you. It's not right. Marjorie managed a weak smile. Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot. Sarah hesitated, then added, We all know you did the right thing. It's just… Dr. Green. I understand, Marjorie said, noting the fear in Sarah's eyes. She couldn't blame her colleagues for their silence. Green's influence was far-reaching and terrifying. As Sarah left, more staff members trickled in. Each expressed their sympathy, their regret. But none offered to stand up to Green, to fight for her. With each visit, Marjorie felt more alone. She carefully packed her personal items into a cardboard box. Her degrees, once a source of immense pride, now felt hollow. Her collection of thank you cards from grateful patients brought a fresh wave of pain. Would she ever have the chance to help people like that again? The reality of her situation began to sink in. She was unemployed, her reputation tarnished. Who would hire her now? How would she pay her bills? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. As she closed the box, Marjorie caught sight of herself in the small mirror on her desk. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The confident, compassionate doctor was gone, replaced by someone lost and broken. This isn't fair, she whispered to her reflection. I did everything right. I helped people. I saved lives. How can that be wrong? But the empty office offered no answers, only a deafening silence that echoed her loneliness. Later that evening, Dr. Alexander Green adjusted his bow tie in the mirror of his luxury car before stepping out onto the red carpet. The annual Medical Excellence Gala was in full swing, and he was determined to make the most of this networking opportunity. As he entered the grand ballroom, adorned with crystal chandeliers and elaborate floral arrangements, Green's eyes swept over the crowd. He spotted several hospital board members and wealthy donors, his lips curling into a smug smile. Dr. Green, called out Dr. Thompson, a fellow hospital administrator. Quite an eventful day at Hamilton, I hear. Green chuckled, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. Indeed, my dear Thompson. Had to let go of that troublemaker, Dr. Winston. You know how it is. Can't have bleeding hearts ruining our bottom line. Dr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Winston, wasn't she one of your top surgeons? Skill means nothing without proper judgment, Green scoffed. The woman had no concept of how a business operates. Treating patients without insurance? It's preposterous. As they conversed, more guests gathered around, drawn by Green's booming voice and commanding presence. He reveled in the attention, his chest puffing out with pride. You see, he continued, gesturing with his champagne glass, hospitals aren't charities. We're here to make money, plain and simple. If people can't pay, well, that's their problem, isn't it? A few nervous chuckles rippled through the small crowd. Green, emboldened by the alcohol and his captive audience, pressed on. Winston was always soft, always trying to bend the rules. But they need help, Dr. Green, he mimicked in a high-pitched voice, as if that matters. We have a responsibility to our shareholders, not to every sob story that walks through our doors. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Green was too caught up in his own rhetoric to notice. His face flushed red as he became more animated, his true colors shining through. I tell you, it's people like her who are dragging this profession down. We're not social workers, for God's sake. We're businessmen first, doctors second. The sooner everyone realizes that, the better off we'll all be. As Green's rant continued, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. Some guests exchanged worried glances, while others tried to subtly distance themselves from the increasingly volatile doctor. As Green continued his tirade, his face grew increasingly red, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Mid-sentence, he suddenly clutched his chest, his champagne glass slipping from his grasp and shattering on the marble floor. Dr. Green? Dr. Thompson asked, concern etching his features. Are you all right? Green opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His eyes widened in panic as he stumbled backward, gasping for air. With a heavy thud, he collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing in pain. The room erupted into chaos. Guests screamed and backed away, creating a circle around Green's writhing form. Dr. Thompson knelt beside him, loosening his bow tie and checking his pulse. "He's having a heart attack," Thompson shouted. "Is there a doctor here? We need help." The irony of the situation was lost on no one. At a gala filled with medical professionals, not a single person present was qualified to perform the necessary life-saving procedure. "Call an ambulance," someone yelled from the crowd. "There's no time," Dr. Thompson replied, his voice shaking. "He needs immediate intervention. Does anyone know how to perform an emergency coronary angioplasty?" Silence fell over the room as the gravity of the situation sank in. Green's face had turned an alarming shade of blue, his breathing shallow and labored. One of the board members stepped forward, wringing his hands nervously. "What about Dr. Winston? She's skilled in emergency procedures, isn't she?" Dr. Thompson's eyes widened in realization. "You're right. She might be our only hope." He turned to a nearby staff member. "Quick, call Dr. Marjorie Winston. Tell her it's an emergency." As they waited anxiously for a response, the cruel irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The very Dr. Green had publicly humiliated and fired earlier that day was now his only chance at survival. Marjorie sat on her couch surrounded by half-packed boxes. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and her hands trembled as she held a framed photo of her medical school graduation. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a cruel movie she couldn't turn off. Suddenly, her phone rang, startling her out of her misery. She glanced at the screen, surprised to see the hospital's number. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Maybe they realized their mistake. Maybe they were calling to apologize and ask her to come back. With a shaky hand, she answered, "Hello? Dr. Winston?" It was Dr. Santos's voice, urgent and strained. "We need you at the medical gala. It's an emergency." Marjorie's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't work at the hospital anymore. Dr. Green fired me, remember?" "It's Dr. Green," Santos blurted out. "He's having a heart attack. We need someone who can perform an emergency coronary angioplasty. You're our only hope." The words hit Marjorie like a punch to the gut. Dr. Green, the man who had humiliated her and crushed her dreams, was now depending on her to save his life. She closed her eyes, a whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Dr. Winston, are you there?" Thompson's voice crackled through the phone. Marjorie's mind raced. Part of her wanted to refuse, to let Green suffer the consequences of his actions. But the larger part, the part that had driven her to become a doctor in the first place, couldn't ignore a cry for help. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she heard herself say, almost as if someone else was speaking through her. As she grabbed her keys and rushed out the door, Marjorie's thoughts were a jumbled mess. How could fate be so cruel? How could she face the man who had just destroyed everything she had worked so hard for? In her car, she gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. "You're better than this," she whispered to herself. "You became a doctor to save lives, not to hold grudges." But as she sped towards the gala, doubt crept in. What if she couldn't do it? What if her emotions got in the way? What if she failed and Green died under her care? The very thought made her stomach churn. Marjorie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She thought of Gladys and her baby, of the countless lives she had saved over the years. She had to push her personal feelings aside. A life was at stake, and that was all that mattered. As she pulled up to the glittering venue, Marjorie steeled herself for what lay ahead. She was no longer Dr. Marjorie Winston, the fired and disgraced physician. She was Dr. Marjorie Winston, the skilled surgeon who had taken an oath to preserve life. With determination in her eyes, she stepped out of her car and strode towards the entrance, ready to face whatever challenges awaited her inside. Marjorie burst through the doors of the grand ballroom, her eyes scanning the chaos before her. The glittering chandeliers and elegant decorations stood in stark contrast to the panicked faces of the gala attendees. In the center of the room, Dr. Green lay on the floor, his face ashen and contorted in pain. Without hesitation, Marjorie rushed to his side, her medical instincts kicking in. She knelt beside him, quickly assessing his condition. "I need a defibrillator and a coronary angioplasty kit, stat," she called out, her voice calm but authoritative. The room fell silent as everyone watched in awe. Here was the woman Dr. Green had publicly humiliated and fired just hours ago, now fighting to save his life. The irony was palpable, but Marjorie pushed aside any thoughts of revenge or satisfaction. As the necessary equipment was brought to her, Marjorie worked with precision and focus. Her hands moved swiftly, inserting the catheter into Green's artery with practiced ease. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but she remained laser-focused on the task at hand. "Come on, Dr. Green," she muttered under her breath as she guided the balloon to the blocked artery. "Stay with me." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Marjorie's colleagues, who had remained silent during her firing, now watched in amazement as she demonstrated her exceptional skills. As she worked, Marjorie couldn't help but reflect on the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. The man whose prejudice and greed had cost her her job was now completely dependent on her expertise. Yet she felt no triumph, only a deep sense of duty and compassion. Minutes ticked by like hours as Marjorie fought to clear the blockage in Green's heart. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her hands remained steady. Finally, she felt the catheter slide through, restoring blood flow to Green's heart. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room as Green's color began to improve. Marjorie sat back on her heels, exhausted but relieved. She had done it. Despite everything, she had saved the life of the man who had wronged her. As paramedics arrived to take over, Marjorie stood up, suddenly aware of the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. The room erupted in applause, a stark contrast to the humiliation she had faced earlier that day. As the paramedics wheeled Dr. Green away on a stretcher, the room buzzed with excitement and awe at what they had just witnessed. Marjorie stood quietly, her heart still racing from the intensity of the moment. She felt a mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. But the peace was short-lived. As Green was being lifted into the ambulance, he suddenly regained full consciousness. His eyes darted around wildly before settling on Marjorie. Instead of gratitude, his face twisted into a scowl. "What are you doing here?" he spat, his voice weak but filled with venom. "You have no right to be at this event. You're fired, remember?" Marjorie was stunned. She took a step back, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Dr. Green, I just saved your life," she stammered. Green's face reddened with anger. "Saved my life? You disobeyed hospital policy again. Who gave you permission to perform that procedure? You're reckless and disobedient." The crowd around them fell silent, shocked by Green's outburst. Marjorie felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She had expected at least a grudging thank you, but this was beyond cruel. "Sir," one of the paramedics interjected, "Dr. Winston's quick action saved your life. Without her—" "Without her," Green interrupted, "we wouldn't be in this mess. She's a liability to this hospital and the medical community. I want her banned from all future events." Marjorie stood there, rooted to the spot as Green continued his tirade. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some sympathetic, others avoiding her gaze altogether. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her. "Dr. Green," she said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I understand you're upset, but I did what any doctor would do. I saw someone in need and I helped. That's what we're trained to do." Green sneered at her words. "Don't lecture me about being a doctor. You're nothing but a troublemaker who can't follow simple rules. Your so-called compassion is a weakness, and it has no place in modern medicine." As the paramedics began to load Green into the ambulance, he called out one last time, "Mark my words, Winston. This isn't over. You'll regret ever laying a hand on me." The ambulance doors slammed shut, leaving Marjorie standing alone in a sea of whispers and stares. She felt a deep ache in her chest, not from physical exertion, but from the weight of Green's words and the realization that her act of kindness had only deepened the conflict between them. In the days following the gala incident, whispers and hushed conversations filled the halls of Hamilton Private Hospital. Dr. Marjorie Winston's name was on everyone's lips, her act of saving Dr. Green's life despite his cruelty becoming the stuff of legend. Nurses huddled in corners during their breaks, recounting the story with a mix of awe and frustration. "Can you believe she saved that man's life after how he treated her?" one nurse said, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's Dr. Winston for you," another replied. "She's always put patients first, no matter what." Even some of the doctors who had previously kept their distance from Marjorie found themselves admiring her integrity. Dr. Sarah Chen, a young resident, confided in a colleague, "I wish I had half her courage. Standing up to Green like that, it's incredible." But despite the growing admiration, fear still gripped many of the staff. Dr. Green's influence loomed large over the hospital, and few dared to openly support Marjorie. They'd seen what happened to those who crossed him. Meanwhile, Marjorie sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at a stack of unpaid bills. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She was jobless, her reputation tarnished by Green's accusations. The weight of injustice pressed down on her shoulders, threatening to crush her spirit. She picked up her phone, scrolling through messages from former colleagues. They were full of kind words and support, but none offered concrete help. Marjorie sighed, feeling more alone than ever. Maybe Green was right, she muttered to herself. Maybe my compassion is a weakness in this world. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she remembered Gladys and her baby, alive because Marjorie had chosen compassion over protocol. She thought of countless other patients she'd helped over the years, lives she'd touched and changed for the better. Marjorie stood up and walked to her bedroom mirror. She looked at her reflection, really looked, for the first time since the incident. Her eyes were tired, but there was still a spark of determination in them. "No," she said firmly to her reflection. "My compassion is not a weakness. It's my strength. It's what makes me a good doctor." With renewed resolve, Marjorie began to plan her next steps. She couldn't let Green's actions define her career or her worth. She had skills, experience, and most importantly, a genuine desire to help people. Those things didn't disappear just because one man decided she wasn't valuable. Marjorie picked up her phone again, this time to call an old friend who ran a free clinic in a low-income neighborhood. It wasn't the prestigious position she'd had at Hamilton, but it was a place where her skills and compassion would be truly appreciated. As she dialed the number, Marjorie felt a glimmer of hope. This setback didn't have to be the end of her story. It could be the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could practice medicine the way she believed it should be practiced, with empathy and care for all patients regardless of their ability to pay. The doorbell rang, startling Marjorie from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone. With a sigh, she rose from her chair and made her way to the front door. When she opened it, her eyes widened in surprise. There, on her doorstep, stood Gladys, the pregnant woman whose life she had saved at the hospital. Gladys was beaming, her round belly even more prominent than before. "Dr. Winston!" Gladys exclaimed, her voice filled with joy. "I'm so glad I found you." Marjorie blinked, momentarily speechless. "Gladys? How did you find me?" Gladys smiled sheepishly. "I asked around at the hospital. It took some doing, but a kind nurse finally gave me your address. I hope you don't mind." Marjorie shook her head, still stunned. "No, not at all. Please, come in." As they settled in Marjorie's living room, Gladys reached out and took Marjorie's hand. "Dr. Winston, I came here to thank you. You saved my life and my baby's life. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Tears welled up in Marjorie's eyes. She had been so caught up in her own troubles, she'd almost forgotten the lives she'd touched. "Gladys, you don't need to repay me. I was just doing my job." "But it was more than that," Gladys insisted. "I know you broke the rules to help me. I know you lost your job because of me. I'm so sorry." Marjorie squeezed Gladys's hand. "Don't be sorry. You and your baby are alive and healthy. That's all that matters." Gladys's eyes shone with gratitude. "You're an amazing doctor, Dr. Winston, and an even better person. I promise I'm going to tell everyone about what you did for me. People need to know there are still doctors out there who care more about saving lives than making money." As Gladys spoke, Marjorie felt something shift inside her. The weight of injustice that had been crushing her began to lift. Here was living proof that her actions had made a difference, that her compassion mattered. "Thank you, Gladys," Marjorie said softly. "You have no idea how much your words mean to me." Gladys smiled, patting her belly. "This little one is going to know all about the brave doctor who saved us, and when he grows up, I hope he'll be as kind and caring as you are." For the first time in days, Marjorie felt a genuine smile spread across her face. She realized that even though she had lost her job, she hadn't lost her purpose. She was still a doctor, still someone who could make a difference in people's lives. As Gladys prepared to leave, she turned to Marjorie one last time. "Dr. Winston, I want you to know that I'm not going to stay quiet about what happened. People need to hear your story. They need to know there are still good doctors out there fighting for what's right." Gladys left Marjorie's house with a fire in her heart. She knew she had to do something to help the kind doctor who had saved her life. As soon as she got home, she pulled out her phone and opened her social media accounts. With shaking fingers, Gladys typed out her first post. "I'm alive today because of Dr. Marjorie Winston. She saved my life and my baby's life when no one else would help us. But instead of being praised, she was fired. This isn't right. We need to stand up for Dr. Winston." She hit post and waited. At first, nothing happened. But then, slowly, likes and comments started trickling in. People were shocked by Gladys's story. They wanted to know more. Encouraged, Gladys kept posting. She shared more details about her experience, about how Dr. Winston had risked everything to help her. She asked if anyone else had stories about Dr. Winston's kindness. To her surprise, people started responding. A man wrote about how Dr. Winston had stayed late to comfort his elderly mother. A woman shared how Dr. Winston had caught a rare condition that other doctors had missed. Gladys's campaign was growing. She created a hashtag, "Justice for Dr. Winston." It started to spread. Local news stations picked up the story. They interviewed Gladys, who spoke passionately about Dr. Winston's compassion and skill. "She's the kind of doctor we all wish we had," Gladys said, her eyes shining with tears. "How can we just stand by and let her lose everything for doing the right thing?" As the days passed, more and more people joined Gladys's cause. They held small rallies outside the hospital, carrying signs that read, "Bring back Dr. Winston" and "Compassion over profit." The pressure on the hospital administration was mounting. Dr. Green, who had seemed so powerful before, now looked nervous when he spoke to the press. "We're reviewing the situation," he said stiffly, sweat beading on his forehead. Marjorie watched all of this unfold with a mix of disbelief and hope. She hadn't expected anyone to fight for her, least of all Gladys. But here was this young woman, leading a movement in her name. One evening, as Marjorie scrolled through the countless messages of support online, her phone rang. It was a local TV station, asking if she'd be willing to share her side of the story. Marjorie hesitated. She'd been staying quiet, afraid of making things worse. But now, seeing all these people standing up for her, she felt a surge of courage. "Yes," she said firmly. "I think it's time people heard the truth." As she hung up the phone, Marjorie felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. As the public support for Dr. Marjorie Winston continued to grow, Dr. Alexander Green found himself in an increasingly precarious position. The once confident hospital administrator now felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. His usual tactics of intimidation and control were no longer working, and he could feel his grip on power slipping away. Green paced in his office, his face red with anger and frustration. He couldn't believe how quickly things had turned against him. The sight of protesters outside the hospital windows only fueled his rage. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I won't let that woman ruin everything I've built." In a moment of desperation, Green's eyes fell on a stack of legal documents on his desk. A twisted smile spread across his face as an idea took shape in his mind. The next morning, Dr. Marjorie Winston was shocked to receive a hand-delivered envelope. With trembling fingers, she opened it, her heart sinking as she read its contents. Dr. Green had filed a malpractice lawsuit against her. The accusations were severe. Green claimed that Marjorie had repeatedly endangered patients by ignoring hospital protocols. He painted her as a reckless doctor who put her own judgment above established rules, risking lives in the process. Marjorie felt like she couldn't breathe. She had always known Green was ruthless, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The lawsuit threatened not just her job at Hamilton Private Hospital, but her entire medical career. As news of the lawsuit broke, it sent shockwaves through the community. Gladys, who had been leading the campaign to support Marjorie, was devastated. How can he do this? Gladys cried, her voice choked with emotion. Dr. Winston saved my life, and now he's trying to destroy hers. The lawsuit cast a dark cloud over the growing movement to reinstate Marjorie. Some supporters began to doubt, wondering if there was truth to Green's accusations. Others stood firm, believing more strongly than ever that this was an act of desperation from a man clinging to power. For Marjorie, the days that followed were a blur of meetings with lawyers and sleepless nights. She knew she had always acted in her patient's best interests, but now she faced the daunting task of proving it in court. As she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by medical textbooks and case files, Marjorie felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about everything she had worked for, everything she believed in. Marjorie sat at her small kitchen table, staring blankly at the stack of legal papers before her. The weight of Dr. Green's lawsuit pressed down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She felt like a tiny boat lost in a stormy sea, tossed about by waves much bigger than herself. How did it come to this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. All she had ever wanted was to help people, to save lives. Now her entire career hung in the balance. The phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. It was her lawyer, Mr. Peterson. Dr. Winston, he said, his voice kind but firm. We need to start preparing your defense. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? Marjorie nodded, then remembered he couldn't see her. Yes, she replied softly. I'll be there. After hanging up, she looked around her apartment. Books and medical journals were scattered everywhere, evidence of late nights spent reviewing cases and procedures. But now, instead of filling her with pride, they only reminded her of what she stood to lose. The next day, Marjorie found herself in Mr. Peterson's office. The lawyer's desk was covered with documents, and his eyes were tired behind his glasses. Dr. Winston, he began, I won't lie to you. This is going to be tough. Dr. Green's accusations are serious, and he has the hospital's resources behind him. Marjorie felt her heart sink even further. But I didn't do anything wrong, she protested weakly. I was just trying to save lives. Mr. Thompson nodded sympathetically. I believe you, but we need to prove it. We'll need to go through every case Dr. Green mentioned in his lawsuit, gather evidence, find witnesses. It's going to be a long process. As they began to sift through the mountain of paperwork, Marjorie felt overwhelmed. Each document seemed to blur into the next, and she struggled to focus. The enormity of the task ahead left her feeling drained and hopeless. What if we can't prove it? She asked suddenly, her voice small. What if I never get to practice medicine again? Mr. Peterson paused, looking at her with concern. Dr. Winston, I can see how much this is affecting you. Have you considered talking to someone? A therapist, perhaps? Marjorie shook her head, feeling ashamed. She was supposed to be strong, to fight this. But the truth was, she felt more vulnerable and powerless than she ever had before. As she left the lawyer's office that afternoon, Marjorie felt no closer to clearing her name. The future stretched out before her, uncertain and frightening. She wondered if she would ever again feel the satisfaction of saving a life, of making a difference. The thought that Dr. Green's manipulation might rob her of that forever was almost too much to bear. As Marjorie left Mr. Peterson's office that day, feeling defeated and lost, she had no idea that the tides were about to turn in her favor. A few days later, Mr. Peterson called Marjorie with excitement in his voice. Dr. Winston, you need to come to my office right away. We've found something big. When Marjorie arrived, she found Mr. Peterson surrounded by stacks of papers, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Dr. Winston, we've uncovered some shocking evidence about Dr. Green, he said, his voice low but filled with energy. Marjorie's heart began to race. What is it? She asked, hardly daring to hope. Mr. Peterson spread out several documents on his desk. We've found proof that Dr. Green has been embezzling funds meant for charity patients, he explained. He's been pocketing money that was supposed to help people who couldn't afford treatment. Marjorie's eyes widened in disbelief. But how? She stammered. He's been falsifying records, inflating costs, and skimming off the top, Mr. Peterson said. It's all here in black and white. As Marjorie looked at the evidence, she felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Anger at Dr. Green's betrayal of everything a doctor should stand for. Sadness for the patients who had suffered because of his greed. But most of all, she felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "What does this mean for my case?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Peterson smiled. "It changes everything, Dr. Winston. This evidence not only discredits Dr. Green, but also shows a pattern of unethical behavior. It supports your claim that you were fired unjustly for following your medical oath." For the first time in weeks, Marjorie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She took a deep breath, feeling as if she could finally see a way forward. "We need to act fast," Mr. Peterson said, his voice full of determination. "We'll present this evidence to the hospital board and the court. Dr. Green's corruption is about to unravel, and with it, the case against you." Marjorie nodded, feeling a surge of energy she hadn't experienced since before her firing. "What can I do to help?" she asked, ready to fight for her career and reputation. As they began to plan their next steps, Marjorie felt the momentum shifting. The dark cloud that had been hanging over her started to dissipate, replaced by a glimmer of light. She knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time she believed she might actually win. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Marjorie's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, approached the stand. His confident stride belied the gravity of the moment. Marjorie sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on her attorney. "Your Honor," Mr. Peterson began, his voice clear and strong, "I'd like to present evidence that not only exonerates Dr. Marjorie Winston, but also exposes the true nature of Dr. Alexander Green's leadership at Hamilton Private Hospital." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dr. Green, sitting on the opposite side, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mr. Peterson held up a stack of documents. "These financial records show a clear pattern of embezzlement by Dr. Green. Funds meant for charity patients were systematically diverted into personal accounts." Gasps echoed through the room. Marjorie's heart raced, but she kept her composure, her face a mask of calm determination. As Mr. Peterson detailed the evidence, projecting spreadsheets and bank statements onto a large screen, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. Hospital staff members in attendance looked at each other in shock, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "Furthermore," Mr. Peterson continued, "we have testimony from hospital employees who were pressured by Dr. Green to falsify records and turn away uninsured patients, regardless of their medical needs." At this, Dr. Green's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is nothing but hearsay and speculation." The judge, her eyes narrowed, looked at Mr. Peterson. "Do you have concrete evidence to support these claims?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mr. Peterson replied, producing a USB drive. "We have recorded conversations and email exchanges that corroborate these testimonies." As the damning evidence unfolded, Marjorie felt a mix of vindication and sadness. She had always known she was right to help those in need, but seeing the extent of the corruption at her former workplace was deeply disheartening. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as email after email was displayed, showing Dr. Green's callous disregard for patient welfare in favor of profit. His face grew increasingly pale as his unethical practices were laid bare for all to see. Marjorie's eyes swept across the room, taking in the shocked expressions of her former colleagues. Some looked ashamed, others angry, but in many faces, she saw a growing respect and admiration directed at her. As Mr. Peterson concluded his presentation, the judge called for a brief recess. The courtroom erupted into hushed conversations. Marjorie remained seated, feeling a strange calm wash over her. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt the tide turning in her favor. As the judge called the court back to order, a hush fell over the room. All eyes were on her as she cleared her throat and addressed the courtroom. "In light of the evidence presented, I am dismissing the lawsuit against Dr. Marjorie Winston," she declared firmly. "Furthermore, I am recommending a full investigation into Dr. Alexander Green's financial activities at Hamilton Private Hospital." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom, followed by a burst of whispers. Marjorie felt a wave of relief wash over her, so powerful that tears sprang to her eyes. She turned to her lawyer, who gave her a reassuring nod and a smile. Dr. Green, on the other hand, looked shell-shocked. His face had turned ashen, and he seemed to shrink in his seat as the reality of his situation sank in. His lawyer leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, but Green appeared too stunned to respond. As the courtroom began to clear, Marjorie was surrounded by well-wishers, former colleagues, patients, and even some members of the press who had been covering the trial. Gladys, her belly now swollen with her growing baby, pushed through the crowd to embrace Marjorie. "I knew you'd win," Gladys said, her voice choked with emotion. "You're a hero, Dr. Winston, to me and so many others." Marjorie hugged her back, feeling a surge of gratitude for this woman who had stood by her through it all. In the days that followed, the fallout from the trial was swift and decisive. Dr. Green was forced to resign from his position at Hamilton Private Hospital. His reputation in tatters, he faced not only professional disgrace but also the very real possibility of criminal charges for his embezzlement. As news of Green's downfall spread, more stories began to emerge of his unethical practices and the lives that had been affected by his greed. The contrast between his actions and Marjorie's selfless dedication became even starker, cementing her status as a local hero. For Marjorie, the vindication was bittersweet. While she was relieved to have her name cleared and her principles validated, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness for all the patients who had suffered under Green's leadership. The morning after the trial, Marjorie woke up feeling lighter than she had in months. The weight of uncertainty and injustice that had been pressing down on her was finally gone. As she sipped her morning coffee, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from the hospital board requesting an urgent meeting. Marjorie arrived at the hospital, her head held high. As she walked through the familiar corridors, she noticed the whispers and admiring glances from staff members. It felt surreal to be back in this place that had been both her sanctuary and her battleground. In the boardroom, she found herself face to face with the hospital's top executives. Their usual air of superiority was gone, replaced by sheepish expressions and nervous fidgeting. "Dr. Winston," the board chairman began, his voice uncharacteristically humble, "we owe you a sincere apology. Our actions, influenced by Dr. Green's misrepresentations, were unjust and deeply regrettable." Marjorie listened silently as they detailed the extent of Green's deceptions and their own failure to see through them. They spoke of the damage done to the hospital's reputation and their desire to make amends. "We would like to offer you not just reinstatement, but a promotion to Chief of Emergency Medicine," the chairman said, sliding a contract across the table. "Your integrity and dedication to patient care are exactly what this hospital needs to rebuild trust." For a moment, Marjorie was tempted. The position she was being offered had been her dream for years. But as she looked at the faces around the table, she realized something had fundamentally changed within her. "I appreciate your apology and your offer," Marjorie said, her voice steady and clear, "but I'm afraid I must decline." The board members exchanged shocked glances. They clearly hadn't expected this response. "Dr. Winston, please reconsider," one of them pleaded. "We're prepared to offer you full autonomy in running the ER, increased budget for charity cases." Marjorie held up a hand, silencing him. "It's not about the terms," she explained gently. "This experience has shown me that my calling lies beyond these walls. I've realized that I can do more good working directly with underserved communities, where my skills are truly needed." As she spoke, Marjorie felt a sense of peace settling over her. This decision, she knew, was right. She was no longer the same person who had walked out of this hospital in disgrace months ago. She had grown, become stronger, and discovered a new purpose. "I hope you understand," she concluded, standing up. "I wish you all the best in rebuilding this institution. May it truly become a place of healing for all who need it." With those words, Marjorie turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a stunned silence. As she stepped out of the hospital into the bright sunshine, she felt a surge of excitement for the future. She didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but she knew she was ready to face it on her own terms. Marjorie sat in her small apartment, sifting through a pile of job offers that had flooded in since her story went public. Each one promised prestige and high salaries, but none of them felt quite right. She sighed, feeling a bit lost despite her recent victory. Just then, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Marjorie hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Dr. Winston speaking," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Dr. Winston, this is Dr. Samantha Chen from Hope Community Hospital," a warm voice replied. "I've been following your story, and I must say I'm incredibly impressed by your dedication to patient care." Marjorie felt a spark of interest. Hope Community Hospital was known for its work with underserved populations. "Thank you, Dr. Chen. That means a lot coming from you." "I'll cut to the chase, Dr. Winston. We're opening a new charity wing at our hospital, dedicated to providing top-notch care to those who can't afford it. We'd like you to lead it." Marjorie's heart skipped a beat. "Lead it?" she repeated, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Yes," Dr. Chen confirmed. "We need someone with your compassion, skill, and unwavering commitment to patients. You'd have full autonomy to shape the program as you see fit." Tears welled up in Marjorie's eyes as Dr. Chen continued to outline the position. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, a chance to help those truly in need, without the constraints of profit-driven policies. "Can I visit the hospital and discuss this further?" Marjorie asked, her voice filled with hope. "Of course, we'd be delighted to have you," Dr. Chen replied enthusiastically. The next day, Marjorie walked through the doors of Hope Community Hospital. The atmosphere was different from Hamilton Private Hospital. There was a sense of warmth and purpose that permeated the air. Dr. Chen greeted her with a friendly smile and gave her a tour of the facility. As they walked, Marjorie saw doctors and nurses treating patients with genuine care and respect, regardless of their ability to pay. "And this," Dr. Chen said, stopping in front of a construction area, "will be the new charity wing. We're calling it the Beacon of Hope Wing." Marjorie's eyes widened as she took in the space. She could already envision the lives that could be changed, the hope that could be restored within these walls. "What do you think, Dr. Winston?" Dr. Chen asked, watching Marjorie's reaction closely. Marjorie turned to her, a bright smile spreading across her face. I think this is exactly where I'm meant to be." Months later, the community center buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life gathered to celebrate Dr. Marjorie Winston. Colorful balloons and streamers adorned the walls, and a large banner read, "Thank you, Dr. Marjorie," in bright, cheerful letters. Marjorie stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile and heartfelt hugs. She felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. Each familiar face that walked through the door reminded her of the lives she had touched throughout her career. Gladys, now holding her healthy baby boy, approached Marjorie with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Marjorie," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I can't thank you enough for what you did for us. You saved both our lives that day." Marjorie gently squeezed Gladys's hand. "Seeing you and your beautiful baby healthy and happy is all the thanks I need," she replied, her own eyes glistening. As the celebration continued, more patients came forward to share their stories. An elderly man recounted how Marjorie had stayed late to ensure he understood his medication. A young girl, once critically ill, proudly showed Marjorie her latest report card. Each story touched Marjorie's heart, reminding her why she became a doctor in the first place. The room fell quiet as Gladys stepped up to a small podium. "Dr. Marjorie," she began, her voice carrying across the room, "you didn't just save my life and my baby's life. You showed us all what it means to be truly compassionate, to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. You've inspired us to be better, to care more, and to never give up." Marjorie felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to Gladys's words. She looked around the room, seeing nods of agreement and tears of joy on many faces. "We're all here today," Gladys continued, "because you've touched our lives in ways we can never fully express. But we want you to know that your kindness, your dedication, and your love for others have not gone unnoticed. We're here to celebrate you, Dr. Marjorie, and to thank you for being our hero." The room erupted in applause, and Marjorie felt herself being gently guided to the front. As she stood there, facing the crowd of smiling faces, she felt a profound sense of belonging and purpose. Marjorie stood on the sidewalk across from Hamilton Private Hospital, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of the building where she had spent so many years. The bustling street around her faded into the background as memories washed over her. She took a deep breath, surprised by the lack of bitterness she felt. As she gazed at the hospital entrance, Marjorie remembered the countless times she had rushed through those doors, eager to help her patients. She thought of the late nights, the emotional highs and lows, and the bonds she had formed with her colleagues. But most of all, she remembered the moment she had chosen to save Gladys and her baby, despite the consequences. A small smile played on Marjorie's lips. That decision, which had seemed to cost her everything, had actually given her so much more. It had shown her the true strength of her convictions and the power of standing up for what was right. Marjorie began to walk slowly past the hospital, her steps measured and calm. She noticed a young doctor hurrying into the building, looking stressed and overwhelmed. For a moment, she saw herself in that doctor, remembering the pressure and the constant struggle to balance compassion with policy. As she continued her walk, Marjorie reflected on how much her life had changed. Her new position at the charity wing of another hospital allowed her to focus on what truly mattered, helping those in need without the constraints of profit-driven policies. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that her work was making a real difference in people's lives. Passing by the hospital's small garden, Marjorie paused. This had been her favorite spot to gather her thoughts during difficult shifts. Now, standing here as an outsider, she realized how far she had come. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her after being fired had transformed into a quiet confidence and inner peace. Marjorie thought about Dr. Green and the lawsuit that had threatened to destroy her career. Instead of feeling anger or resentment, she felt a sense of closure. That experience had taught her the importance of integrity and had ultimately led her to where she was meant to be. As she reached the end of the block, Marjorie turned to look at the hospital one last time. She no longer saw it as a place of lost dreams or injustice. Instead, she saw it as a chapter in her life that had shaped her into the person she was today. Stronger, more compassionate, and more determined than ever to make a difference. With a newfound sense of peace, Marjorie turned away from the hospital and continued her walk. She felt lighter, as if the last remnants of doubt and regret had finally lifted from her shoulders. Her journey had been about more than just her career. It had been about discovering her own strength and the power of staying true to her values. Marjorie stepped into the bustling charity wing of her new hospital, a warm smile spreading across her face. The hallways were filled with a different energy here, one of hope and compassion. As she made her rounds, she greeted each patient by name, taking the time to listen to their concerns and offer words of encouragement. "Dr. Winston, thank you for everything," an elderly patient said, grasping Marjorie's hand. "You've made such a difference here." Marjorie's heart swelled with emotion. "It's my pleasure, Mr. Johnson. How are you feeling today?" As she continued her rounds, Marjorie reflected on how different this environment was from Hamilton Private Hospital. Here, she was surrounded by a team that shared her values and supported her dedication to patient care. Later that afternoon, Marjorie gathered with her colleagues for their weekly meeting. The room was filled with laughter and animated discussion as they shared ideas on how to improve patient care and outreach programs. "Dr. Winston, what do you think about expanding our community health education program?" asked Dr. Sarah Chen, one of Marjorie's new colleagues. Marjorie's eyes lit up. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Sarah. Let's brainstorm some topics we could cover." As the meeting concluded, Marjorie felt a deep sense of contentment. She had found her place, a place where she could practice medicine according to her principles and make a real difference in people's lives. Walking back to her office, Marjorie paused to look out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. She thought about her journey, the challenges she had faced, the difficult decisions she had made, and the unexpected turns her career had taken. But through it all, she had stayed true to herself and her values. And now, here she was, exactly where she was meant to be. Marjorie turned away from the window, a sense of peace and purpose filling her heart. She picked up a patient's file from her desk, ready to tackle the next challenge with optimism and renewed energy. The future was bright, and she was eager to see what it held. If you enjoyed the story of Dr. Marjorie, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.